Hi, everybody, and welcome to Is That Even Constitutional? This is a podcast where we use the lens of the Constitution to dissect current events. My name is Sadhana Devaraja, and I'm not a constitutional scholar, but lucky for me, my good friend Ken Thomas is. Hi, Ken. How are you?
Hi, Sadhana. How are you?
I am doing well. So, this is our second season. We're calling this Project 2026 series. And today we are discussing the sixth proposal in an arc of 10 winnable proposals that we think will help us reclaim the Constitution through legislation. We covered ending the filibuster, ending gerrymandering, making Election Day a national holiday, setting term limits for the Supreme Court, ending the Electoral College. And today, we're going to be talking about making the District of Columbia, D.C., which is our nation's capital and ends up being a free-floating city without a state, into a state, and thereby gaining the right to vote. So, Ken, maybe you could start us off by just telling us like how it came to be that D.C. exists as a city without the right to vote.
Okay, Sadhana, that is one of those historical accidents, one might even say. So there is something early on in the before the Constitution was written, when Congress was meeting in Philadelphia, and we had an event called the Pennsylvania Mutiny. And the Pennsylvania Mutiny actually was something that almost foreshadowed the January 6th attack on Congress. The Pennsylvania Mutiny was caused when 400 unpaid soldiers of the Continental Army surrounded the Independence Hall in Philadelphia, where Congress was meeting. Congress asked the Pennsylvania governor for protection for the members of Congress, and Pennsylvania refused, pretty much leaving Congress without any protection from these soldiers who were essentially surrounding the building that they were working in. Because of this, the members and the senators essentially fled, left the building, got on trains, and agreed to reconvene in Princeton, New Jersey, where they were essentially acted as the Congress in a different place. And so this was basically something that stuck with the founding fathers, and the founding fathers decided that in the Constitution they were going to provide for an exclusive jurisdiction of land that was under Congress's direct control. It was not under the control of any state. And now the reason that the residents of D.C. didn't get to vote is that it was assumed that federal officials would be living in D.C., members, senators, members of the executive branch, and because of that, it was assumed that these people would already have significant authority, significant influence over a Congress, and so that they wouldn't need the additional power of having a vote for members and senators. So the Constitution provides that this exclusive jurisdiction would be up to 100 square miles, and nobody in that district would have representation in Congress.
And so, based on that like initial assumption that most of the people living there would be impacting like federal government, it kind of made sense not to vote. But what's kind of the reality today? What does DC look like today?
Well, DC is now filled, obviously, with a lot more people than members of the federal government, and we have at least 500,000 people. And at this point, it's actually more. The population is increasing, but most of these people have no more influence over the government than any member of the various states. The district, however, is really large enough and powerful enough economically to really vie for position as a state. The district has more people than Vermont and Wyoming. The economy is bigger than 15 other states. Residents pay more federal taxes per capita than any other jurisdiction than any other state, and the taxes that are paid as a whole represent more money than 21 other states. It's also a very politically active population. 80% of eligible residents cast a ballot in the last election. And finally, I should say that DC residents are strongly behind statehood and are interested in becoming a state and would like more representation at the national level.
Yeah, and so it sounds like it's extremely popular, especially for residents who haven't had this representation. Has So assume when you said that the kind of 100 square miles of land were set aside for DC, like it came from one of the states. Could you tell us a little bit about where it came from and how you're seeing statehood be viable?
Sure. So the DC has been its current size for quite some time. However, it used to be quite a bit bigger. And the idea for statehood is that the portion of DC would become a state, and then a portion would remain as Washington, DC, as the federal enclave. So Maryland and Virginia initially ceded 100 square miles, but the district was really not that big for that long. In 1846, 31 square miles were returned to Virginia. The idea being that this was land across the Potomac River and it wasn't really being developed. And the idea was that if you give it back to Virginia, then you would get it would turn into a more developed area. So this reduction in size would be very similar to what the DC residents would be using if they wanted to become a state. Now, this proposal has been very seriously considered. In 2020, the House passed the Washington, D.C. Admission Act, which reduced the size of D.C. to 2 square miles. This 2 square miles would contain Congress, the White House, the Supreme Court, most of the federal buildings in the area, but there are essentially no residents in that square mile because it is essentially just federal buildings. So 66 square miles would then be admitted as a new state. Now, this would be something that would not require a constitutional amendment because there still would be a Washington, D.C., there still would be a federal enclave with exclusive federal jurisdiction. This would just be the admission of a state from the 66 square miles that would be broken off of Washington, D.C. And admission of states is done by legislation, not by constitutional amendment. So if this legislation went forward, and as I said, the House passed it once, then the DC would get 2 senators and 1 representative and would be essentially on par with other states on regarding representation.
That's fascinating. So it gets back to like that original assumption in some ways and that original intent of giving DC that protection and also making sure that kind of the people that are directly involved are not getting like undue influence through that extra representation and giving that territory to the states. It's an interesting way to move forward. So hearing that this is popular among residents, hearing that there are a couple of ways forward to get folks representation, is there a reason that the residents of DC should not have representation?
Well, that's a really good question. So I should say up front that DC having no federal representation is really unusual. No other country in the world has it, and the original reason for DC to not have votes is obsolete since federal officials now live in Maryland and Virginia. So the opposition would appear to be principally partisan, and so as Senator Ted Kennedy said once, opposition to DC statehood is probably because the city is considered too liberal, too urban, too black, or too democratic. This is because DC does have a high proportion of black residents. If it became a state, it would have the highest proportion of black residents of any state, but the fact that they do not have this means that there are a significant number of black voters who have been disenfranchised. So the principal arguments against statehood is that it would violate the Constitution. In 2019, I testified before the House Committee on Oversight and Reform in the Congress. This hearing lasted over 5.5 hours and is one of the most partisan hearings I've ever seen. There were hundreds of questions, questioning the constitutionality of the legislation. The protest was that founding fathers would not have contemplated such a small federal enclave. This is textually something that has very little support. The Constitution only provides that the federal enclave be no larger than 100 square miles. It says nothing about it being smaller than 100 square miles. And we should point out that the Supreme Court would be very unlikely to find that DC can't be made smaller, because this would mean that the prior retrocession of land to Virginia was also unconstitutional, would have to be reversed, which is a very unlikely scenario. So in general, although there has been opposition based on, or allegedly based on the Constitution, most of the opposition is probably principally partisan and is based on the fact that DC might vote in a particularly partisan way, meaning it would be more likely to vote for Democrats.
Wow. And so that original intent is completely getting kind of like turned on its head here with by exacerbating this longstanding history of disenfranchising Black voters. And now most federal officials and employees that were kind of, or even it wasn't the employees, it was really federal officials and representatives who were intended to be not part of the voting bloc here. They live in Maryland, Virginia. They have representation. So this is really just denying representation to other folks. So what about, you said that, it sounds like the Constitution would allow for this. What about the 23rd Amendment? So I think the 23rd Amendment is where, DC does have presidential electors in the Electoral College. How would this impact how that works?
Well, so the 23rd Amendment is interesting. It's not that old, maybe a few decades old, and it does show that the nation understands that the lack of vote in D.C. is something that shouldn't occur. So the 23rd Amendment was passed to give Washington, D.C. 3 presidential electors in the Electoral College. So if you are in Washington, D.C., you can vote for the president, and D.C. has 3 presidential electors. So the problem is that if you essentially empty the enclave of Washington, D.C., then there are 3 electoral votes that are essentially difficult to assign because there will be essentially no residents in Washington, D.C. There is a question whether the president living in the White House would have residency sufficient, but that is not, something that is probably practical result here. So the real answer is that if legislation was passed providing statehood, then Congress would clearly have to, at the same time, propose a constitutional amendment to the states that would repeal the 23rd Amendment. It essentially would be a dead letter and would be something that probably, just to avoid any concern about where those 3 electors go, would be something that could be resolved relatively quickly. So this would be a bit of a cleanup of the Constitution that would be necessary, but it's not a real barrier to providing for a new state using legislation. So the only real barrier is political will to do so. This is an issue that most of the nation would probably be amenable to. And if you poll, you find about 40% of people say they are opposed to DC statehood, but 60% are either in support or don't have strong opinions. And that's something I think that could be changed if there is a strong movement and strong discussion of how unfair it is that DC people can't vote. So I don't think the 23rd Amendment is a real hindrance to this proposal.
Thanks, Ken. So thanks for walking us through why it's important to get the folks in DC some representation. You gave us reasons for, why this is extremely popular, some of the original intent of why this came to be in the first place, and how we've kind of changed along the way. And folks that live in DC really should have that representation. There are a couple of paths forward that seem possible, either by changing the boundaries of DC or by giving DC statehood to be able to gain that representation. So appreciate you talking that through for us. Thanks everybody for listening. We're looking forward to closing this out with the next few with you all. To get in touch with us, to give us your feedback, feel free to leave comments, subscribe, like, especially if you're enjoying the content. And if you want to help make these proposals a reality or give us any other further feedback, you can always email us at production@constitutionpod.com. Thanks, folks.
Thanks, Adna.